If you have ever tried to just ignore something in a difficult family relationship, you've probably discovered something frustrating. It does not work. That's not because you're too sensitive, and it's not because you're holding a grudge. It's because you're responding to more than the latest incident. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. This video is not really about ignoring. It's about a question that I think deserves a much deeper answer. Why can some people seemingly brush off certain behaviors while others find that completely impossible? And the answer almost always is that the issue was never the latest comment. It was not the most recent criticism or the throwaway remark at the dinner table. It is the history attached to it, and it is everything underneath it that went before. And if we're going to understand that properly, we also need to make a really important distinction that most people never make. And that's the distinction between healthy acceptance and something far more destructive, which is self-abandonment. So stay with me, because I think this one is going to really land a lot for you. Before we get into the substances, though, I want to give you a little context about where I am coming from. I'm a chartered psychologist. I've been working with individuals and families, dealing with family estrangement and difficult family patterns for over a decade now. It was the focus of my doctoral research. But beyond the professional side of things, I also have my own lived experience of family estrangement. So I understand what it feels like to be told just to let it go, when letting it go feels like it would mean losing yourself in the process. So I'm not saying this and sharing this to make this about me, but I think it's important for you to know this doesn't come from someone who only reads about it in textbooks. I have lived in these dynamics, and I have sat with hundreds of people who have lived in them as well. And what I've learned, both personally and professionally, is that the advice to just ignore it is one of the most misunderstood and potentially harmful pieces of guidance that gets handed out in the context of these harmful family dynamics. So let's get into why. You're not reacting to one incident. This is probably the most important thing I can say in this entire video, and I really want you to sit with it. When someone on the outside looks at your reaction to a family member's behavior, they often see something specific. So they see one criticism, they see one sarcastic comment, they see one dismissal. And from that limited vantage point, your reaction can look disproportionate. It can look like overreacting. It can look like you're being too sensitive or making a big deal out of nothing. But here is what the outside observer doesn't see. They don't see the last 10 years. They don't see the last 100 comments. They don't see the repeated invalidation that has accumulated like sediment, layer after layer, until the ground beneath you feels completely unstable. So when you react strongly to what looks like a small moment, you are not reacting to that moment in isolation. You're reacting to a pattern. You're reacting to a history. You're reacting to the cumulative weight of everything that came before. And this is something that most people fundamentally misunderstand about these harmful family dynamics. The problem is rarely the final straw. The problem is the final straw is what the final straw is sitting on top of. So think about it this way. If someone steps on your foot once, it hurts, sure, but you recover quickly. If someone steps on the same foot every single day for 20 years, then one day that when they do it again, you scream. Nobody's going to be surprised by the scream. But that's exactly what happens in these situations. People around you see only the latest step. They don't see the bruise and the injury that has never been allowed to heal and that has accumulated. They don't see the way you have been bracing for impact every single time you walk into a room with that person. They don't see the hypervigilance, the scanning for the tone, the way your nervous system fires before a single word has ever been spoken. So when someone tells you to just ignore it, what they're really asking you to do is pretend all of that history doesn't exist. They're asking you to respond to this one moment as if it exists in a vacuum. And it does not. It never has. Now, here is where I want to take this layer deeper, because I think this is where the real insight lives. Emotionally unsafe families often depend on silence. Many dysfunctional family systems do not just tolerate silence, they require it. They are structurally built on things that are never discussed. So, abuse that everyone witnessed but nobody named, addiction that everyone navigates around but nobody acknowledges. It could be the favoritism that is obvious to every person in the room, but it's treated as if it doesn't exist. It could be the scapegoating that follows one family member from childhood into adulthood while everyone pretends that the treatment is fair. Boundary violations, for example, that are repackaged as love or concern or closeness. That one is so common. In these systems, just ignore it is not neutral advice. It's a maintenance strategy. It is the mechanism by which the family keeps itself exactly as it is. And let me tell you what this mechanism can look like. Megan grew up in a family where her uncle made cruel comments about her body at every gathering. Everyone heard it. Her mother changed the subject. Her father said, "You know what he's like." Her cousins laughed awkwardly and maybe looked down at their plates. But the rule was never spoken, but everyone understood it. The comfort of the family mattered more than discomfort of the person being targeted. Then, one occasion, one Christmas, it happened again, and Megan exploded. She blew up, and suddenly the problem was not her uncle's comments. The problem was Megan being dramatic. She was being divisive, unable to let things go. And that's how this mechanism works. The behavior is protected. The person naming it becomes the disturbance. And when you're told to ignore problematic behavior, what you're really being told is do not disrupt the equilibrium. Do not name what's happening. Don't challenge the unspoken rules. Because the moment you stop ignoring it, the moment you say, actually, this is not okay, you're not only addressing one behavior, you're threatening the entire structure. And that is why the pushback is often so fierce. So it's not that your family members necessarily actually disagree that the behavior is wrong. In many cases, they probably know it's wrong, but they have built their own coping around the agreement that nobody says so. Perhaps they don't like conflicts. There could be lots of reasons for that. And your refusal to keep ignoring it doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone who has been relying on your silence to keep things comfortable. And that is really such an important thing to understand because it reframes the entire dynamic. You're not being difficult by naming what's happening. You are breaking a contract that you never actually agreed to. So that contract was actually imposed on you, often in childhood, and you didn't have the ability to negotiate its terms, which brings me to a distinction that I think is genuinely one of the most important things I can offer in this video. Ignoring is not the same as acceptance. These two things get conflated constantly, and the confusion between them causes enormous harm. So let me be clear here about the difference. Ignoring means suppressing your feelings. It means pretending that something doesn't matter when it does. It means tolerating behavior indefinitely without ever making a conscious choice about whether that tolerance is healthy or sustainable. And it means swallowing your own reality to keep the peace. Acceptance is something entirely different. Acceptance means seeing reality clearly. It means looking at a person or a situation and understanding what it actually is rather than what you wish it were. It means recognizing limitations, both yours and theirs. And it means making informed choices based on that clear understanding. This is what I really want you to hold on to. Acceptance does not mean pretending something is healthy. It means seeing it clearly. You can accept that a family member is unlikely to change and still decide that their behavior is unacceptable in your life. Absolutely valid. You can accept that someone has their own pain and their own history and still recognize that their way of expressing it causes you genuine harm. You can accept reality and still choose to protect yourself from it. That is not holding a grudge. That is not being unforgiving. That is wisdom. That is what it looks like when someone stops abandoning themselves in order to maintain a relationship that is not being maintained from the other side. And I want to talk about the cost of this because I think a lot of people watching this video will have spent years, even decades sometimes, doing exactly what they were told, ignoring it. letting it go, being the bigger person, keeping the peace. And the cost of that is rarely visible to everyone else, but it is very real. It shows up as anxiety that you cannot explain. A message comes in and your body reacts before your mind has even caught up and processed it. You feel depleted before a family gathering has begun or before you're due to go, because you've already rehearsed every possible interaction and braced yourself for the worst. It shows up as a gradual, perhaps insidious loss of self-confidence, because when you spend years being told that your reactions are wrong and that they're excessive, that you should just be able to let things go, you start to believe it. You start to doubt your own perceptions. You start to wonder if maybe you really are the problem. And I want to tell you something with absolute clarity. You are not the problem for having a normal human response to being treated badly. The problem is not your sensitivity. The problem is that you were told your sensitivity was the issue instead of the behavior that triggered it. Now, I want to add another layer to this because I think it helps explain why so many people get stuck in this pattern for so long. Children learn to ignore in order to survive. When you're a child in a difficult or toxic family environment, ignoring is genuinely adaptive. It can be a survival strategy. And not just in extreme cases, even in families where dysfunctional patterns are more subtle, children learn very quickly that what they're allowed to notice and what they're supposed to overlook. You cannot leave. You're dependent on these people for your safety, for your shelter, for your food, for your emotional development. You cannot set boundaries because you don't have the authority or the language or the power to do so. You can't challenge authority and safely because the consequences of doing so might range from withdrawal of affection to something much worse. So you learn to ignore. You learn to minimize. You learn to tell yourself that it's not that bad. You learn to absorb the impact silently and carry on. And as a child, that strategy might be genuinely important to keep you safe. So the problem is that many adults, if they continue using that same strategy long after it stops serving them, long after they've gained the autonomy and the resources and the independence that would actually allow them to make different choices, they keep ignoring it because it's the only response they ever learned. They keep minimizing because they were trained to believe that their feelings were an inconvenience. They keep tolerating because somewhere deep inside them, the child who needed to survive is still running the show. That's not a criticism. I say this with enormous compassion because breaking out of a survival pattern that was wired into you in childhood is one of the one of the most difficult things a human being can do. It requires you to override programming that was installed when you're at your most vulnerable developmental stages of your life. It requires you to trust your own perceptions after years of being taught to distrust them and told that those perceptions are wrong. So it takes support and it takes time and it takes a willingness to accept that the strategy that once protected you might now be the very thing keeping you stuck. There's a phrase that often comes alongside just ignore it. And I want to address that directly. That phrase is, well, that is just how they are. And I understand why people say it. In some cases, it's even technically accurate. Maybe the person genuinely is not going to change, and maybe their behavior is very deeply entrenched in them. Maybe expecting them to suddenly become a different person is unrealistic. Fine. I can accept that. Maybe you can accept that. But here's the question that almost never gets asked in response. Okay, that is how they are. Well, what about how this affects you? Because understanding why someone behaves the way they do does not automatically make the behavior acceptable in your life. Understanding that a person has their own trauma, their own limitations, their own unresolved pain doesn't mean you're obligated to absorb the consequences of all that indefinitely. You can hold compassion for someone's history and still say this is something I can't continue to be exposed to. Those two things are not in conflict with each other. Understanding behavior and accepting its impact on your life are two completely separate processes. One doesn't cancel the other out. So if ignoring doesn't work, what does? I want to give you something practical here because I think it's important this video doesn't just validate what you're already feeling, but also gives you a framework for how to move forward. And I want to offer this as a process rather than a single piece of advice because it's not simple and it shouldn't be treated as if it is. The first step is to notice. Just allow yourself to register that something hurt. That might sound basic, but for some people who've spent their years minimizing or just acknowledging that hurt can actually be revolutionary. So there's no justifying it. You don't need to justify. You don't need to compare it to what other people go through. You just need to let yourself feel it without immediately trying to talk yourself out of it or agreeing to dismiss it or whatever. The second step is then naming it. So get specific about what actually happened, not the story you tell yourself about it, not the softened version that you would offer to keep the peace, but the actual event. What was said, what was done, what was the impact? Precision matters here because vagueness is one of the tools that keeps people stuck. So when everything stays fuzzy in general, it's easy to dismiss it. But when you name it clearly, it becomes much harder to ignore. The third step is to understand. Ask yourself why it affects you so strongly, and not in a way that's designed to minimize your reaction, but in a way that honors it. So what does it connect to? What history does it activate? What pattern does it belong to? This is where you often discover that your reaction is not about this one incident at all. It's about the whole accumulated weight of the relationship. And the understanding is really powerful because it stops you feeling like you're overreacting and helps you see you're actually having a perfectly proportionate response to something much larger than it appears on the surface. The fourth step is to decide. Now that you've noticed, named, and understood, you get to choose. How empowering is that? What do you want to do with this information? And I want to emphasize the word want here, because for many people, this is the first time they have ever been told they get a choice. They are actually allowed to make a decision about how they respond rather than defaulting to whatever keeps everyone else comfortable. The fifth step is to act. That action might look like setting a boundary. It might look like having a conversation, if that's possible. It might look like creating distance. It might look like genuine acceptance based on a clear understanding of reality. It might look like something else entirely. There is no single right answer here because every situation is different and every person's threshold is different. But the key is whatever you do, it comes from a place of conscious choice rather than automatic suppression. So I want to leave you with one final thing that I think is really important. People often tell us to ignore difficult family behavior because they imagine that the only alternative is conflict. They picture arguments and confrontations and dramatic fallouts. So ignoring seems like the reasonable, mature, peaceful option. But here is another alternative that nobody talks about very often. And it is this: to see what is happening clearly, to stop minimizing impact, to stop telling yourself that you should be able to handle it, and to stop measuring your worth by your ability to absorb pain without complaint. And instead to make thoughtful, informed, considered decisions about what place that relationship can realistically occupy in your life. And that's not based on guilt, not based on obligation, not based on what you were taught as a child, but based on a clear, honest assessment of what is actually happening and what you genuinely need, which is not selfish, not cruel, and not abandoning your family. It is choosing, maybe for the first time, not to abandon yourself. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. And please, please, please support my work to get the message out there by sharing and subscribing to my channel.